Hi, I want to talk a little bit about Module 4, which is on the Good Neighbor, covering the lectures Becoming Good Neighbors and the Culture of the Good Neighbor. So, where we last let off, we're in the late 1920s. There's mounting conflicts between the United States and Latin America, diplomatically, militarily, as we're deeply involved in countries such as Nicaragua, but also places like Cuba, places in the Caribbean, Central America. And 1929 should be understood as an important turning point because of the global depression that really is the trigger that leads to a fundamental rethinking, a willingness or necessity of rethinking the Roosevelt corollary in particular, and the larger question of the nature of the Pan American relationship, which was clearly in crisis, or certainly bearing a very heavy weight at the time. So we have the rising costs. We talked about the political costs, to be sure, but there are military costs in terms of our engagement, but especially because of 1929, now the rising economic costs. And we need a new strategy for sort of reconstituting what Pan-Americanism means and looks like. This is the context in which Franklin Roosevelt, who comes to power in 1932, inaugurates this language of the good neighbor, that the United States is now going to be a good neighbor. And by implication, the United States had been perhaps a bad neighbor before. It doesn't say that, but that's the implication, right? Now, the good neighbor, as we've seen as a term, had been in circulation. It shows up for the first time, to my knowledge, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Ironically enough, right, the treaty that resolves the U.S.-Mexican War back in the mid-19th century. But it had also been used, or in various manifestations of this kind of language, by the Hoover administration in the 1920s. There had been efforts to promote a more favorable diplomatic climate, even as a kind of counterbalance to all the hostility that was being shown. But it's really under Roosevelt that there's a clear articulation of the idea of the good neighbor and its elevation to what I would call a strategic discourse. That is, it becomes the foundational basis around which U.S. strategy toward Latin America is going to be reconstituted during the 1930s and indeed into the 1940s. And this strategy of the good neighbor is based on three fundamental ideas. One is that there is a pledge of non-intervention. And this is a pledge that gets codified first in 1933 and then gets reiterated in all the subsequent consultations that take place during these meetings of the American states that will happen with increasing intensity as World War II approaches. So the United States pledges non-intervention. We in effect withdraw the Roosevelt corollary. And this becomes very important for reestablishing a sense of diplomatic trust, if you will. A second component is the economic component, the importance in the context, especially in the early 1930s, of maintaining economic exchange as countries around the world are kind of closing up, hunkering down, throwing up their tariff walls. And in the context by the late 1930s of the rise of the fascist powers, Germany in particular, but also Japan, that had a very large industrial sector and were willing to barter even or sell goods to Latin American countries. And so we're very interested in keeping trade oriented towards the United States. It's also, though, in the 1930s, economically, a moment when larger countries, especially Brazil and Mexico, a little later in the 1940s, Argentina as well, are looking to get away from the export of primary source goods, coffee, bananas, cotton, etc., and instead try to industrialize their own economies. So in certain respects, the 1930s is a fascinating moment when the United States has to follow the economic lead of Latin America if it wants to hold together this coalition. And we see, for example, the nationalization of U.S. oil companies in Mexico, a major event. And the United States maintains a hands-off policy. We do not intervene, even though 10 years earlier, maybe we would have intervened. But the Roosevelt corollary is over. The Good Neighbors, the new policy in the United States, recognizes the need strategically to maintain favorable diplomatic relations. And so we accept a certain level of economic nationalism in Latin America, certainly for the larger countries. Smaller countries, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Cuba, different issue. Okay, the third issue aspect. So the first aspect is pledge of non-intervention. Second aspect is new economic set of relationships. The third aspect is a new cultural dimension. And this is very important, and we're going to have a whole lecture. You're going to watch a film related to the effort to remake and reposition, if you want, the idea of the United States as part of a Pan-American community. Remember, there's a contestation that has emerged over what is Pan-Americanism. Jose Ingenieros famously had said, "I am not now, nor can I ever be, a Pan-Americanist." Well, the United States needs to contest that, needs to respond to that declaration, that denunciation. And in fact, that's what the culture of the Good Neighbor is all about, of trying to bring back this idea that the United States is part of an American community. Again, this is all about forging a somewhat fictitious notion that the United States, even though we're Anglo, we were much more recent than the other Latin American countries and so forth, is constituted as one of Latin America. A first amongst equals, to be sure. So that's going to be very important for this, the idea of the new culture of the Good Neighbor. And all of this, these different components lay the basis for what will be a very strong diplomatic, economic, and ultimately military alliance that comes together to fight World War II, to fight the fascist powers in World War II. Brazil and Mexico will in fact send troops to fight in that war. All of Latin America, with the exception of Argentina, which is a very interesting case. It hedges its bets and maintains neutrality until the very end. But the rest of the Latin American countries will sell their materials, raw materials, strategic materials needed for the war effort at below market prices. They could get more because there's a war taking place, but they sell it at below market prices to the United States to help in the war effort. Mexico sends laborers to the United States under the Bracero Agreement to help fill a labor shortage as U.S. soldiers, male soldiers, went to the war. So there are lots of areas of cooperation, and it all takes place under this rubric, the strategic discourse of the Good Neighbor, which becomes so foundational and will stay in place through about the mid-1950s. And as we'll see in a subsequent module, the final module, it's really mid-1950s with the onset of the Cold War in particular, that the Good Neighbor once more, the Pan-Americanism once more becomes contested and then truly subverted, exploded, attacked, however we want to phrase it, with the advent of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. But we'll see it begins to get unraveled even before that. However, let me note that the pledge of non-intervention, non-overt intervention, there will be covert intervention as we will see, but overt intervention holds forth until 1965. The United States, in 1965, we send in troops to prevent what's seen as a potential second Cuba in the Dominican Republic. But from 1933, when we withdraw troops from everywhere in Latin America, until 1965, the Pledge of the Good Neighbor is upheld. And it becomes a very important touchstone for Latin American nationalists and the basis for reestablishing a sense of trust and cooperation between Latin America and the United States. Okay, enjoy the film. It's fantastic. You're going to love it.